Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Leanne and I am the co-founder of She Loves Tech, and it is such a pleasure to be partnering together at All That Matters. We've actually just launched this kind of series. She loves gaming, she loves music, and now she loves sports. And joining me today are these wonderful, wonderful ladies, and I am going to be letting them introduce a little bit about themselves. And also just want to clarify, because Catherine, maybe I can start with you, right? You are the founder of W Series. And can you maybe share a little bit about, W Series and about how this came about?
Well, I was unemployed and I was looking for a job, but historically I'd been a lawyer that specialised in sport, and then I was a banker that did sports and leisure deals. I stopped working at 45 to have my first and only child, and my friends were taking bets between themselves as to how long it would be before I started working again. One person did win, they said 2.5 years, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my career, as I knew I didn't want to be an advisor anymore. But just at that time when I was thinking about what was happening or what was going to happen with the rest of my career, I had a drink with a couple of friends who worked in Formula One, and they said, what about a women's only motor racing series? I thought, that's a fantastic idea, and then I went back and I thought, well, this is a rubbish idea, because if men and women can compete equally, why do we need a separate series? But fortunately, I carried on doing some research, and I realized that that in the previous 8 years, if you looked at the numbers of women that were racing in single-seater series throughout the world, in the previous 8 years, the numbers were going down year on year. And this was in 2017, when women's sport was really starting to emerge as an important global commercial phenomenon. So I believed that something needed to be done, and it took 2.5 years to raise the money and get the team together to race, and we had our first race in 2019. In our second season was cancelled because of COVID, and we came out fighting last year. And we had formed a partnership with Formula One. So we now race as a support series with Formula One. So we're racing all over the world. This weekend represents our first race in Asia, so we're incredibly excited to be here. We are, as I'm explaining to you, a very, very new brand, but we are becoming very popular in certain territories. So for example, in the UK, after our home race, our Silverstone race, we had over 1 million people in the UK alone watching the race. So we're really, really excited about our growth. I suspect lots of you here haven't heard W Series, but part of my job is to come here and explain more. So just to give another sort of minute about what W Series is. So you know it's an all-female championship, but we race in identical cars, and that is because we want to find out who the fastest female drivers are. Our drivers are this year are from 14 different countries all over the world. We have 2 Asian drivers. And we also pay all of the expenses of the drivers. So we're not about finding out who the richest drivers are, who's got the richest dad. We're about finding out who the fastest female drivers in the world are. And that's a perfect segue to go into Jamie, because Jamie has won our first 2 years. She's our champion in the first 2 years, and this weekend she may well win the championship this year. So moving over to a true champion.
So there's so many things to unpack, and I think we're going to in a bit. But Jamie, why don't you tell us about, how you started driving and a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I started in racing in go-karts. I was actually relatively old, which people are surprised to hear. I was 12 years old when I started, and I only got into it because my older brother started in go-karts, and just, I guess, sibling rivalry meant that I felt like it was something that I wanted to try as well. And it was just a hobby, really, something I loved doing. I was, from the age of 12 to 14, would go maybe once a month with my brother and just followed in his footsteps, really. Was very blissfully and kind of nicely, ignorantly unaware of the fact that I was the only girl doing it. I just did it because I enjoyed it. And it went from there, really. It just kind of escalated year on year, became something that got more and more serious. I started prioritizing it over, other things, and I stayed at school, but it was something that I kind of in the back of my mind knew I wanted to do. I just didn't really know how. And for any driver to succeed in the sport, you need, unfortunately, an enormous amount of financial support and backing to progress through the sport. And whilst I was very fortunate my parents supported me for sort of the initial part of my career, it was definitely not an inevitable thing of me going to go all the way. And I got to the end of, I think it was 2018, and it kind of sort of felt like that was kind of my career, from the racing side, done. And, I had quite a good run at it, but not, obviously to where I wanted to be. And that's when W Series came about, which gave me this new opportunity at professionalised women's sport, women's motorsport overnight. As Catherine said, it gave this opportunity where funding wasn't an issue. You just had the opportunity to drive and to race, which is all that I wanted to do. And then now to be here, sat in Singapore in the third year, potentially on the brink of the third title, with people talking about me maybe going to Formula One is madness to me, but something that I'm going to grab with both hands and an opportunity I'm going to take, and something I really believe is possible.
Thanks, Jamie. And Joe, you've had a lot of experience in sports and entertainment. Can you tell us a little bit about that and also about Octagon?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I think congratulations to Catherine for everything that she has done in sort of setting a benchmark for women in motorsports. It's a huge achievement and just a real start of where you're at and what there is to follow. So I'm the managing director of Octagon. We are a sport and entertainment creative marketing agency. We work with a number of brands that could well be within this room. I'm blinded by the light here, so can't see faces. And we typically work with brands who want to partner either with rights holders or talent to tell a shared story. And that's something that's really important to us, is looking at what that sort of creative narrative is, and the role that both sports, partnerships and talent can play in the overall sort of marketing mix of a brand's narrative.
I love that. Okay, and so anyone who has an F1 ticket, please also come. It starts at 4:45, right, Catherine? W Series, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, to see the amazing Jamie and the rest of the team's race. I think one of the things, Catherine, that you and I were talking a lot about, so She Loves Tech, my organization, we are the world's largest startup competition and accelerator program for women in technology, and we operate globally, 72 countries around the world. And we come from the premise that women are not charity, right? We believe that we are accelerating. We've had 10,000 startups come through She Loves Tech, and we're accelerating the best entrepreneurs who happen to be women. It sounds like you're doing the same in the racing and driving world. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Well, as I said earlier on, there is a massive gender imbalance in motorsport. So if you look at motorsport before 2019, it was all about the men. There are lots. I sit on the governing body in the UK of motorsport, and we look after 13 different motorsports. And it's not just the single-seater racing, which is what Formula One is and what we do. There are lots of other motorsports, and for some reason, it is just dominated by men. But
do you
the
know
world
the gap? Like, what is that, statistically, what does that gap look like?
Less than, so in the UK, we have, on the driving side, we have 5% of license holders are women, and we believe that is the highest in the world. So it
5% is the highest.
But we're not just about promoting drivers. We're also, motorsport is a very technologically led sport.
Yes.
So we are also promoting female mechanics and female engineers. And we did have one race last year where 50% of our engineers were women. it is much easier to find at the moment female engineers than it is female mechanics, because apart from Charlene in Neighbours, I don't know who of you have seen, is about the only female mechanic I've ever heard of. That was Kylie Minogue before she became famous internationally, by the way. And she played a mechanic. But what we were talking about earlier on is how collaborative women are together. So our drivers are incredibly competitive when they're on track, but off track, everyone is great friends. We are also great friends with lots of other female sports. So the English soccer team, the English rugby team, lots and lots of different sports want to collaborate with us and work together, because we're all working against quite a strong tide. And whilst we are growing, it's taking an awful lot of effort for us to become much bigger. You know, there was a story in the British press a couple of days ago that the England rugby team, when they travelled to the World Cup, the men went first class and the women are going back in economy. And I tell you, women rugby players going in an economy seat is going to be quite an uncomfortable experience for them. So, you know, there is a gulf of difference between the men's and women's game. But I see that the women's sport is going to grow exponentially. Last year I went to the Euro finals for the men's, and actually I didn't go to the final, I went to the semi-final, and it was a deeply unpleasant experience outside. I was covered in beer walking into Wembley Stadium just by drunk men throwing beer everywhere. The whole of the Premier League, and when England ever plays, it is just full of thugs. The audience is swearing a lot. The difference in going to the women's final this year could not have been more stark. I have never ever in my life been to a football match where people clapped for both anthems. It was an extraordinary experience. It was full of families, full of kids, full of groups of women, and there were lots of men there too. But it was a really joyous, happy occasion. And I think that on the back of that, I think women's sport is going to continue to grow and grow, because families will see it as being a really, really good option for them. And, you know, who knew? It's really entertaining too. You know, people are amazed at how entertaining and captivating our races are. You know, it is, you know, Jamie and her co-drivers are deeply competitive. You know, we have some fantastic competitive movements, or maneuvers rather, on track. So people are understanding that the female side of sport is every bit as entertaining as, you know, everyone says, well, it's fine in tennis, we know tennis is great, but actually what people are learning is that in all other sports, the women's side is just as entertaining. I've rambled on for quite a lot, haven't I? I'll shut up.
No, that's good. And you know, one of the things we notice as well for She Loves Tech is, even though we are a startup competition, that our founders, women founders, are saying, you know what, this doesn't feel like a competition because everybody's cheering and uplifting each other up, right? And so, Jo, maybe, you know, I think then when we talk about women and so many collaborating with so many other women in sports, I guess, Jo, my question would be around how has the, you know, what do you think about, how do you think about building brands around women athletes, right, to help them succeed and uplift each other?
Well, I'll just sort of riff off a little bit what was said here. So for women's sports and some of the comparisons that you made purely around kind of the Euros experiences, there's significant research that's being undertaken, and some of you may be aware of the Sports Innovation Lab. They have some fantastic research that really dives deep over the last 5 years into kind of fans and the sort of the fans of women's sports. What's really kind of critically interesting for brands who are interested, and the reasons why they should get into women's sports, is these fans are much more loyal to the teams that they follow, the clubs, the individuals. they're much more engaged with the brands that are then partnering with those individuals and clubs as well. And therefore, what does that mean? There's more dollars going back to that brand itself. Where I talked earlier about what we do as an agency, it also becomes a lot easier to create that shared story because there's a lot more of a genuine passion in terms of how to start that narrative. There's a lot more sort of common ground in terms of talent and athletes willing to have their backstory shared, and there's a lot more kind of depth sort of to it. The last point that I will make is fans and followers of women's sports are generally much more digitally and technologically savvy and aren't purely reliant on your traditional broadcast channels. So they're much more adept at looking and watching sport and particularly seeking out women's sport in new ways. So yes, the future is definitely there. The funding still isn't there and is yet to follow.
So what needs to change for the funding to follow?
Well, I mean, I could do a poll to the room and kind of ask anyone from a rights holder perspective or a brand here to say, you know, who is actually investing in women's sport? And if I ask people to raise their hands in that space, we'd probably find it's at a sort of fair minimum. So I think the catalyst here is to say is actually genuine look at women's sport as a vehicle and a conversation to enable to engage with your fans.
Okay. And so Jamie, on to you, because, so Catherine has said, in the UK, only 5%, right? And I was reading that globally, it's something only like 2% of women make up the tidal population in motorsports. For you yourself, right, being part of that 2% or even less, how, you know, what are some of the challenges that you've had to overcome?
It's an interesting one because, as I said earlier, I was quite ignorant when I was younger, so I didn't notice it so much. But now looking back, it's not a sport that I necessarily would have thought I would have just got into. I'm surprised that I did, and partly because the environment was very, obviously, male-dominated, all the mechanics, everything when you're growing up. There was no other women, which is what makes W Series actually very special, is the fact that suddenly you're around, there's 18 other drivers, but personnel, everyone, there's probably well over 40 to 50 women involved in the series, and then suddenly you're all kind of part of this whole sort of group together, all very like-minded, and there's something that's really nice about that. But from my side, my focus has always been on performance and doing the best job I can in the car, so that's been my kind of motivator, I guess. But the further I've gone through the sport, the more kind of responsibility, I guess, I feel to try and encourage more and more young girls into the sport, because it really can be a much more diverse sport. It can have what I believe to be a 50-50 split, not just from drivers, but across the board. It's quite cool. My mechanic that I've had for this year so far has just been promoted up to the Alpine F1 team, and is about giving experience, about giving the opportunity to develop, and that's where W Series is so pivotal for the likes of myself, and my mechanic Cleo has just been promoted, because it's giving you that opportunity to develop, like I said, and to get the skill set that you need to progress. And I guess that's the next step now that we've got this sort of level, and also this level of exposure that is hopefully giving the if you can see it, you can be it mentality to these young girls coming through. That will be an additional catalyst to getting more girls starting at a young age.
Yeah, and I believe so much in that, right? That power of representation, that the more you see, the more you can do. Because the reality is that actually a lot of these motorsports are not only for men, right? F1 is not only for men, it's for everyone. But we need to be able to give women the right tools, the right resources, so that they can be trained well, so that they can really be uplifted and compete in the right spaces and the right stages. And so I guess, we don't have a lot of time. I wish we had so much longer, but maybe I can sum everything up, right? With the creation of leagues like W Series, women's sports has made some progress, but there's still so much more to go. We talked about funding, right? We talked about representation. Besides these two, what else needs to be done to move the needle?
Can I take that first?
Of course, Catherine.
I mean, I don't think it's besides funding. Funding is the first, middle, and end part of it. You know, motorsport is an incredibly expensive sport. So to date, we do have, you know, some sponsors. We have Heineken and Puma, and they've been amazingly supportive. And it's fantastic for our brand that we can be associated by global brands. But there is a lot of chat by all major global brands say we want to support women and we want to support women in sport. But the amount of money that global brands are putting into female sport against what they invest in men's sport is still tiny. In many cases, it's less than 10%. And I think what needs to happen is that people in these companies need to start speaking to their board and saying, we need to have some parity here. You know, tennis has moved to parity in so many different aspects. So, for example, in prize money. And tennis, you know, has had the fortune to have Billie Jean King fighting for equality for 50 years. But they now have it. But in all other sports, we are many, many years away from equality. And actually, we're nowhere near to being to having equality. I understand the reasons why, you know, the men can go first class, but then the women can go in economy. But that is because the sponsors are paying tiny fractions of the amount that they're paying for the men's game. And that has got to change.
And I think the conversations around that have to change as well, because it is a mindset, right? And it takes sometimes many, many years to be able to shift that mindset. If you were to kind of say one thing to people, Catherine, to help them understand why this is not a nice to have, it's not just socially good, it's a must have, what would that be?
I always go back to basics about W Series. We're a sport, we're an entertainment. We provide just as much sport and entertainment as the men's side of our sport does. So there's actually, I don't see any reason why we aren't being supported or the sponsors aren't supporting as much as the men's side. Our media partners are incredibly supportive. You know, Sky, for example, in the UK is our live broadcaster, and the support that they have given us this year, and we're the first year with them, has been absolutely incredible. We are their most watched female sport by event, and their second most watched motorsport after Formula One. And therefore, success breeds success. But sometimes it takes for people to feel as though they're taking a bit of a risk to come and join the party, and then they get huge rewards.
And Joe, what do you think needs to happen to be able to move the needle?
It's such a large, big Goliath question to really answer, because ultimately it's got to start at the grassroots levels. It's got to start in schools in terms of how sport is perceived by females, and then it's got to go all the way through to the professional level. So that then reflects into how it is funded, and not just from brands, but from media, rights holders, etc. as well. And it needs a collective effort. There was an article in The Guardian a year ago about kind of, you know, the rise of women's sport, and it feels like it was on kind of the cusp of kind of greatness. And I remember talking to a colleague in this area and just saying, well, is it? Or have we actually genuinely set the benchmark too low? And I think the fact is the benchmark and what we're looking at needs to rise so that there is that greater parity. And then equally from a measurement perspective, when, you know, a proposal's put on the table, you know, it shouldn't just be looked at women's sports versus men's. The data that sits behind men's sports is decades and decades old, and the women's sports is, you know, it's fresh and it's new, and therefore it needs to be considered in a very different vein.
Thanks. Jamie, what would you like to see?
I don't know if it's something I'd like to see, but I think something that does need to change is just the perception of women's sport. I think it's still seen as just not being as good as the men's version. And I think that's where tennis is good, because you watch both games, you don't really compare. You don't think, Serena's serve is slower than Roger serve. You just watch both and you enjoy both as an entertainment platform. And that's where W Series, again, is quite nice, because when the helmet's on, you kind of probably don't even think about it because you can't actually see the female competitor. But I think, yeah, perception definitely needs to change. A little analogy is the Euros I was watching in a pub in the UK when there was a group of girls and a group of my guy friends from school, and they all couldn't believe how good the game was. And I was a bit annoyed at it, and I was trying not to bite, because it's not about them being surprised that it's good, it's about it just being something that we all wanted to watch. And yeah, I just think the perception does need to change, and people need to stop seeing it as being a lesser version. It's just a different version.
I love that. I love that. It's so true, right? That perception really needs to change. The mindset needs to change. So to sum everything up, the three things that I really took down was we need to have the power of representation, right? To have more girls kind of racing, to be able to see more women drivers, the power of collaboration, and also the power of that community as well. And the underlying message is we need to change the funding. Funding is really important, and every one of us plays a part. So please join me. Thank you so much, Jamie, Catherine, and Joe. And Jamie, all the best as well for your race this Friday to Sunday. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel on She Loves Sports.